All right, so it's 10:01 and we will begin. And I'm just going to say welcome to this webinar on Spotted Lanternfly Basics for Christmas tree growers. And thank you for joining us. It's an extremely snowy, cold, wintry day here. It's a good Christmas tree day. We're based in Ithaca. And we have folks from Albany and Geneva and all around, and I'll introduce them. So this webinar is scheduled to be an hour. If there are questions that run over that, we will stay here so that the questions are answered. And I'm just going to run through a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. So there will be a recording of this webinar and it'll be posted on our website, and that's the link. But anyone who's registered for this will have a link sent to them via their email. And it'll take about a week. So sometime early next week, you should see the recording or a link to it. And if you don't get it, just send me an email. I'm Jana Hexter. I work with the Northeastern IPM Center. Sorry, I did not introduce myself. And just send me an email and I'll be happy to check into it and send you the link. And we love your questions. And we have quite a few people on the call, and we've been getting lots of questions with some of the other webinars we've been doing. So what we ask that you do is, if you move your mouse over the screen, you'll see that there's in the black box appears with kind of instructions like how you can mute yourself and that kind of thing. And there's a box that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can ask questions, and you can do it anonymously if you prefer. And we ask that you use that rather than the chat feature, because we can mark when something has been answered, so we can keep track of which questions have been answered. But also at the end, we get a report with all of the questions and the email for the people who asked the questions. So we'll be able to respond to you if if one of the presenters had something that they wanted to add. I'd like to introduce our presenters, and I'm going to introduce Betsy Lamb, who is the Ornamentals and IPM Coordinator with New York State IPM Program. Brian Eshenaur, who's the Ornamentals IPM Specialist with the New York State IPM Program. Ethan Angell, who's a Senior Horticultural Inspector with the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. And Dan Gilrein, Extension Entomologist with Suffolk County Cooperative Extension. And Tim Weigle, the Grape and Hops IPM Specialist for the Northeast IPM Center, who is the coordinating brain behind this presentation. So welcome everyone. And I want to make sure, Betsy, are you in and your sound is working and you can see?
I think my sound is working, and I'll say good morning to everyone.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure, because
I had disappeared somewhere.
We were having a little kerfuffle before we started. So, all right, wonderful. So before we dive in, we're going to I'll just show you what we're going to look at today. We're going to cover the spotted lanternfly biology and identification, pathways and spread, monitoring and management, a regulatory update, and there's plenty of time for questions. We're actually going to be stopping about every few minutes, every 5-10 minutes, to answer your questions. So please do put those in into the Q&A box. And so before we begin, we're going to ask you some questions. This is to give us an idea of your knowledge of spotted lanternfly at the beginning of the webinar. And so I'm going to launch the poll, and you should be able to scroll through. If you don't know an answer to a question, just guess. Just give it your wildest guess. This is not high pressure. It simply allows us. And I think you have to give an answer to every question before it will say that it's complete. So I will just wait for a couple of minutes to give you time to scroll through and answer those questions. And we have about 60 people on the call at the moment. I have one of you that has submitted your vote, so I'm assuming the rest of you have been reading through the questions, and I'll just wait patiently while folks have a chance to complete that. Okay, we've got 40% of you voting, so I'm just going to give it 20 more seconds. Great, so we have 61% of you having voted. Oop, just went up to 64. A couple of you got another one in there. So I will close off the poll, and you'll be able to see the answers. So give me one moment. There we go. And you should be able to see the results. We're actually going to go through the answers later. So you can, we've got quite a few people, 42% who are slightly knowledgeable. So hopefully the needle will move on that during the course of the webinar. And prime characteristics of the N stars, biggest votes has black with white spots. And the fourth N star is identifiable with red with white spots as the biggest vote getter. Well, a splotch of mud for an egg mass is the highest percentage. And you'll see there's some pretty definitive answers there. Okay, and we'll go over those later for those of you who are curious too. All right, wonderful. So with that, we will begin the presentation, the materials, and we're going to start with Betsy Lam is going to be talking about biology and identification. And just tell me when to move the slides, Betsy. Thanks.
I'll try and remember not just click. So, and I get the pictures with all the pretty parts of the pretty insects, I guess. So the spotted lanternfly is an invasive plant hopper. It's not a fly, it's not a moth, and many of the pictures that have been sent around, it looks like a moth, so people sometimes expect to see it flying, but it's much better at jumping. It's native to China and to Vietnam, and it feeds on over 70 plant species in the United States that we know so far. I don't think we know all of the information on this insect, so we're gathering new information as we go. It's a phloem feeder, which means it puts its mouth parts into the phloem, so the sort of the plumbing of the plant, and can pull out sap. So if you think about the sap that's used for maple syrup, it's the same thing. So it's basically sugar water, although it has some additional compounds in it that the insect can use. But you'll hear us talking about honeydew a lot. And honeydew is what is the insect is excreting when it's taken out what it wants out of that sap and excreting many of the sugars because it doesn't need them. They're also swarm feeders. When I'll show you pictures of egg masses, and you can see why they might be swarm feeders, because they are also swarm egg layers. And so there are a lot of eggs in one place, and they don't seem to mind each other. Some insects don't like being around other insects. It's all competition, even of the same species. But this one doesn't seem to mind, so they're gregarious. Next one, please. So the life cycle and the dates on this are based on information from Pennsylvania, and we know Christmas tree growers are used to looking at growing degree days and knowing that they're not the same for every month in every part of the state. But so the eggs are laid by adults in September to December, around that time. The eggs overwinter, that's the stage that overwinters, and then they start hatching in spring, early summer, so May, June. And the first 4 instars, you were right, most people were right on their answers, that they're white with black spots. So it goes through 3 instars and gets larger with each time it goes, when it molts to the next instar. The 4th instar is red, black, and white. They're quite distinctive, and they occur in the late summer, early fall, and then they molt into the adults. And the adults are large, and we'll see some pictures of that also coming up. So the adults can survive July into the winter. We're always looking for information on how cold it needs to be to control either adults and also eggs. And I don't think we have very good information on that, but we're trying to collect that information. Next one, please. I'm so used to having a pointer, I just have to point with my finger. So here are adults laying egg masses. You can see on the right side of the screen the long strings of eggs. So they lay individual eggs and then groups of those sort of strings of eggs, and then they cover them with sort of a mud-like, it looks like mud, compound to protect them, because it's the eggs that have to overwinter. So it starts out looking sort of pale and then sort of pinkish, and then turns brown and then sort of cracks. It ends up looking a lot like bark. And again, if you think about trying to camouflage egg masses to protect them, that's a good way to go about it if you're mostly laying them on trees. Next one. So there's a first to third instar look much the same. They're about 1/8 of an inch when they are first hatched out, and they get up to 3/4 of an inch long by the time they've gotten to the 3rd instar. And these are also good jumpers. Both the larval stages are also good jumpers. And so if you see one, hopefully you won't see one, but if you see one and then you're trying to look at it closely, it may jump. And the first instar is often, or has been, confused with ticks. They don't look that much like ticks, but we don't like looking very closely at insects, so some people have thought they look like ticks. But again, you'll tend to see them in swarms, which is less common in a tick. So the picture you're looking at now is the 4th instar. And then next slide, please. So here are the adults. They're about 1 inch long. It's a big insect when you see them. They're obvious when you see them, especially because they're in such large masses. When they fly, you see the red hind wings. But when they're just on the tree, they usually have their wings folded, so you won't see the red quite so distinctly. Often insects that have red coloration are toxic. So that 4th instar probably doesn't taste good, so other things are not going to eat it. Also, they use the red color on their wings as an alarm for other insects or something that was going to consider eating them. And so we think that they're picking up toxic compounds from the ailanthus that they feed on, which also has toxic compounds in it. And that might be one of the ways that they're protected from being consumed by predators. Next one. So how does the spotted lanternfly feed? If you look in this picture, and if you click on the next picture also, there's the mouth parts. It's a long straw, essentially, that it pushes through the tissue into the phloem. Most insects that feed this way don't have very strong mouth parts and are usually feed on tender tissue. This one has very strong mouth parts and can actually push into wood. So much larger and stronger plant materials. So we find them feeding on twigs and branches, which you might not in some of the smaller plant hoppers. They don't have a strong pump for the sucking part, so it's actually the turgor pressure of the plant that pushes the liquid into the insect. But it will actually pull enough of the sap out of the plant to affect the plant growth, and you can sometimes see yellowing caused by that because there's so many. Here's where we're talking about honeydew. So the sugar water that's excreted as it feeds, because it's only looking for amino acids and nitrogen and probably some sugars, but not all the sugars that are present in the sap. Next one. When you see honeydew on a leaf, it's fairly distinctive. It's sticky and it's shiny often, and then you can see on these leaves that it looks like there's black material there also. That's a sooty mold that grows on the sugars in the honeydew. On the other side, on the trunk, you actually can get sap leaking out of puncture wounds also from the feeding. So sometimes you'll see this larger amounts of liquid and then also the sooty mold growing on that. Next one. I think that's all for me. Does anyone have any questions?
I think we don't have any questions so far, so we'll probably just keep moving forward with the presentation. So thank you, Betsy. So, all right, so next we're going to talk about pathways and spread, and Tim is going to lead us through that.
I think I'll also be helping with some of that. So my name is Brian Eshenaur, and I'm with the New York State IPM program, and Betsy and I work a lot with Christmas tree growers. So this is the region that is affected, the region of Pennsylvania. So we're looking at a close view there. This is the portion of Pennsylvania that borders New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. And in the yellow there, you can see in 2014, this is where it was first located. Moving on to the orange in 2015, it spread to that area. Then 2016 in blue, 2017 in green, and we'll see some updates on some of the other slides that are coming up.
Okay.
So it is estimated that the population of spotted lanternfly can move about 3 to 4 miles a year on their own, which wouldn't be so bad, but they are excellent hitchhikers. They can get on just about anything, and it's believed that they came into Pennsylvania from some rock that was being used for landscape purposes. So the adults and egg masses are the most common stage to hitchhike on inanimate objects or anything, and they can lay their egg masses on most any surface, tree trunks, and they seem to like the texture of rusty metal, but really, again, anything is possible. So, you know, check out anything that moves out of the quarantine zone for all life stages. The adults also have moved, in addition to those eggs that Betsy was showing you, the adults have moved out of the quarantine zone. So close inspection is important, both on the shipping and receiving ends. And there is a checklist that can be found on the New York State IPM program for places to look. Next slide. Yeah, this is just making the point that anything is a fair game where they might be swarming. They are not feeding on the tire, but they're accumulating on the tire and the equipment there. So if that equipment was on a trailer and being moved, you'd be moving the spotted lanternfly with it. Next slide. All right, so a wider view here, taking a look at how the spotted lanternfly has moved. And this is current as of January 2019. And talked about that, the main area in Pennsylvania. Looking at this, we're looking at the areas in a yellow color there where spotted lanternfly has been found, but there's not an active infestation that we know in those areas. You can see there is an active infestation in Northern Virginia and Pennsylvania and Delaware that are being managed, and those are quarantined areas. Go to the next slide. All right, so we know that spotted lanternfly can reproduce and do quite well on this tree host, the tree of heaven. And so it's important to recognize that tree of heaven is widely distributed throughout the United States. It is a weedy species. It's not one you're going to find in a nursery or a garden center, but it will pop up everywhere because it produces a lot of seed. You can see the seed head on the female trees in this slide. So there are male and female trees, and the female trees have that seed head that you're seeing on the right there. Next slide. So some key characteristics to look for with the spotted lanternfly, or I'm sorry, with the ailanthus here, the tree of heaven. We'll start on the right there, looking at the seed pods that are pretty distinctive. We don't see other seed pods like this that are held upright above the foliage. And then the bark, even for larger trees, is smoother, kind of has a net effect, and some compare it to the skin of a cantaloupe. So it's relatively smooth. It never has those deep furrows that you'll see in most other larger trees. And then down at the bottom there, looking at the leaves, those are pinnately compound, so they can be up to 4 feet long and have up to 40 leaflets on them. And taking a close look at the leaflets there, let's go right to the circle. Most of the edge of the leaflets are smooth, but we have a couple lobes there at the base, and that is really characteristic. We don't see that on other trees. Trees that are similar to this and grow in the same areas are sumac and some of the nut trees like black walnut. They can look an awful lot like this because they have pinnately compound leaves, but they don't have these lobes at the base. So that is something to look for that will distinguish the tree of heaven from some other similar trees. They also have a distinctive odor. So if the leaves were to be crushed, you would smell this distinct, not a pleasant odor, let's just say that. And that's not completely diagnostic, because we can also see that with black walnut that has its own distinct odor. But once you smell this, you'll recognize it as a tree of heaven. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it is widely distributed, and we know that the spotted lanternfly does very well on the tree of heaven. Work is underway to determine what other tree species can sustain its full life cycle. Next slide. So there are lots of plants that could be affected by the spotted lanternfly. We know that seeing what has happened in some parts of Pennsylvania, that grapes are fed upon, and this could really impact grapes in New York as well. Apples and hops seem to be hosts that we're concerned about. Just about all ornamental trees, landscape trees, can be fed upon. They have their favorites, though. There's concerns in the lumber industry, and this is a Christmas tree seminar. We don't believe that they can feed on Christmas trees, but we know that they can move on Christmas trees. It has happened. They've moved out of the quarantine zone. So that's our primary concern with Christmas trees. And the maple industry, it's not the preferred host. They really like silver maple and red maple, and then they will feed on sugar maple, but again, it's not their primary host. Next slide. And this is really something that we're hearing about in the region of Pennsylvania where it's occurring, that it really can impact the quality of life. Take a look at that tree on the right there, just covered with adult spotted lanternflies, and they're removing sap, they're giving out honeydew, which then, when it lands on the surfaces below, it will create a sticky substance. Eventually a fungus will grow on that, giving the sooty mold appearance. And that bottom step there was cleaned, and the upper two steps have the honeydew and sooty mold on it. Next slide. Questions on this part?
Yeah, this brings us to questions. Are there any questions, Nancy?
I answered 2 questions on typing wise. Just Wikipedia says pines are a host. Thoughts?
Oh, okay. I think we're learning a lot about the host for this species. Pines aren't typically grown for Christmas trees to any degree, but firs certainly are, and Douglas fir as well. But that
Brian,
is something we'll be looking for. Yes.
this is Tim Weigle. And although spotted lanternfly will lay their eggs on conifers, which is a concern for Christmas tree growers, they are not seen as a really suitable host for feeding by the spotted lanternfly.
Yes.
So I think the big concern would be that spotted lanternfly fed somewhere else. They ran out of room to lay their eggs there, and so they're coming into the conifers for egg laying. And then movement of the egg masses that way.
That's my understanding too. And the adults have been moved on Christmas trees, maybe while they were laying eggs or something else.
Yep.
All right, terrific. All right, well then we shall move on. I'm sure there'll be other questions for folks who have been filtering in since we began. If you have questions, please scroll your mouse over your screen and you'll see a black box turning up, and one of the options there is Q&A. If you click on there, you can ask questions, and you can do that anonymously too. There's a way of you choosing that option. All right, so we will move on with talking about monitoring and management, and I believe Brian and Dan, you're presenting this piece.
Okay, thank you, Jana. This is Dan Gilrein, entomologist with Cornell Extension on Long Island. The biggest risk I see for Christmas tree growers has been when egg masses are laid on the trees. These insects are pretty indiscriminate where they'll lay their eggs, even on rusty metal, stone, concrete, fence posts, of course, plants, including Christmas trees. So that's probably the biggest concern. And then when the trees are moved to other areas, that's one way that the lanternfly can be introduced. Of course, there was a case in New Jersey where the eggs hatched and the nymphs emerged in the house, making for not a very satisfying experience by people who purchased the trees. There have been cases where adults have fallen out of trees shaken at garden centers or at point of sale, and that's a little distressing finding them there as well. But I think the biggest concern is that they could move on Christmas trees and of course be distressing to buyers. Managing spotted lanternfly it takes an integrated approach, and I've listed some of the aspects of that here: public education, awareness, and recognition, which is what this is all about now, monitoring and detection all the way through the supply chain into landscapes and beyond. Also having non-insecticide strategies for managing it, things you can do without insecticides, and then using insecticides where needed. So all of these are actually being deployed to different degrees in managing spotted lanternfly right now. Next slide, please. As mentioned, there are a number of insects that do look a little bit like spotted lanternfly. It helps to see them all together or to see the other ones that look like it. Here are three kinds of stink bug nymphs. These are arboreal, and you would be expecting to see lanternfly lookalikes, or looking for them in trees, not on the ground. So even though ticks do some extent resemble lanternfly, generally, if you're going to be looking for lanternfly, you're going to be looking above the ground in shrubs and trees. Of course, they will go after some herbaceous plants as well. There are some moths and other insects that look a little bit like spotted lanternfly, but from the pictures you saw, they're very, very distinctive. I think the biggest issue for me is helping people recognize the nymphs, because the pictures you'll be seeing, and whenever you hear about it, they'll show pictures of colorful, big, bold adults, but recognizing the nymphs is also really helpful, and they're going to be probably even more common in some cases. Next slide, please. Another aspect that helps in monitoring and management and in recognition is knowing what stages are present at different times of the year. There's only one generation a year of this insect. The adults, which are the most showy, obvious, visible they're going to be present from late July through into mid to late fall. They do die with the cold. They do not overwinter. The nymphs are active over a longer period, from starting around late April through into early fall, maybe early mid-September. And of course, the earlier stages are going to be present earlier, and the older nymphs with the red on them will be present later on. So you can see there's some overlap in the calendar on those. The eggs are present over a longer period of time, and they'll be laid starting in September into October, and then you'll have those present all the way through the winter. So there's a long period of time when those eggs are present on say stone or concrete or vehicles or trees or nursery stock when they can be transported to new locations. And of course, there's a very active industry in moving plant material, particularly in springtime, that can introduce them around. So just being aware of what stages are present at different times, then you have an idea of what you might expect if you're, say, looking at a lanthus or tree of heaven, you know, what stage you'd expect to find any particular time of year. Next, please. Some of these symptoms are already discussed, and you can see the sap streaking on the bark to the right where the adults have been feeding on this tree. There is some foamy material at the bottom of the tree, some residue that's left behind there that would be distinctive. You can get sap streaks from other things, say ambrosia beetle attacks or just the physical damage, but the sap streaking has been mentioned as something that's pretty distinctive and often seen where adults are commonly feeding. The sooty mold and the honeydew in the center picture is also another sign. You can get that certainly from scale insects and aphids. I don't know anything else that would create that on Atlantis, but you could see sooty mold and honeydew on other kinds of plants from other insects, as well as spotted lanternfly, if it were there. But if you were to see that, you would expect to see a fairly large number of insects present that could create such a amount of residue. On the left is a tree that is showing some decline. That's due to heavy infestation. That's the impact that spotted lanternfly can have on particularly some of its favorite hosts. And Atlantis tree of heaven is probably one of its most favorite hosts, and that's why it bears watching. So these are all signs or symptoms of lanternfly besides the insects themselves that you might run into. Next slide, please. Management really starts at the beginning of the supply chain, and here are some pears being loaded in South Korea for shipment. There was a USDA Haphis inspector here looking at the plants, the pears, the fruit that were being shipped, as well as the crates and everything about the shipping containers to make sure that there was nothing being transported. Lanternfly and other invasive species can be introduced in many different ways, not just this way, but this is one way we have to prevent introduction of these invasive species. Next slide, please. And further along the supply chain, both when commodities arrive in the country as well as when they're being shipped out from nurseries to points of sale, or other times when inspections can be done to check for these. So on the left is a vehicle. You can just make out a lanternfly adult that was plastered against the radiator. This was at an entry point into New York. As it was mentioned earlier, the adults are very mobile, can be trapped or moved in shipping containers and vehicles and so forth. You can see the egg mass on that twig there. You can see how easy it would be to move that around, and on the concrete and stone to the right, obviously different ways that you can move spotted lanternfly and things that we need to do to prevent that. So these need to be inspected and care taken not to move them around. Next slide, please. Once lanternfly is in the area, or if it is suspected or you were just watching for it, you can use these sticky traps. These are bands placed around the trunks of trees, tree of heaven or lanthus in particular. There's one on the right that was on Long Island. On the left, you could see a lot of the adults and some of the nymphs that were trapped. These sticky bands are pretty indiscriminate and will trap other species as well. So if you want, you could put a band or a layer of chicken wire over the top of that to reduce the non-target bycatch that you don't want to get. But this is one passive way to detect spotted lanternfly as you place these around the lanthus trees. And as the adults and nymphs move up and down the tree, they get trapped by that sticky material. Next slide, please. You can physically remove not only the lanternflies and nymphs themselves, but egg masses. And this is just a slide showing someone scraping those egg masses into a plastic bag. There's a little bit of rubbing alcohol in that bag that will kill the eggs. So to the extent that you remove those egg masses, it's effective. Of course, if there's, in the case of Pennsylvania, where there's many thousands of adults present, it can be a really impractical job, but it's one way to control them. I think the greater hope that I have is for biological control. One that is actually present and somewhat active is this one. It's a little egg parasitoid. It's a tiny wasp that parasitizes the eggs of lanternflies. Its actually primary target was gypsy moth, but it was found moving over from gypsy moth over to lanternflies. It isn't highly effective, but it is taking out at least some of the population. Now that may change over time as this little parasitoid, which was itself introduced for gypsy moth, learns more about its new host. So maybe it will parasitize increasing numbers of lanternfly eggs. That remains to be seen. Next slide, please. More optimistic is this one. It's another parasitoid that's from Asia. This is now in quarantine and being investigated for control of spider lanternfly. It's parasitized very high levels of eggs and egg masses in China, where it's found. On the right-hand side, on the left, you can see the little wasp, and on the right-hand side, you can see one of the egg masses. The egg that's got a slit in it is where a lanternfly nymph had emerged, but if you look carefully over to the right and all around it, you'll see that there's little holes in some of those other eggs, little round holes, and that's where this wasp has emerged. So I'm hopeful that if this one makes it through the different steps in quarantine, that it will be released and will eventually bring this under control. And that may be what's actually happening with, say, brown marmored stink bug, helping to bring that under control. Next slide, please. There are some natural pathogens or fungi that have been controlling and attacking spider lanternfly in Pennsylvania. On the right, you'll see a lanternfly adult that's been infected with the Bovaria fungus. There is another fungus that's closely related to the one that's been killing off gypsy moths, and that's been found on lanternfly as well. So these things are out in the environment. They operate in different ways. I'm not sure how these fungi will perform if they require very high levels of lanternfly to be active or even effective. So that remains to be seen, but more work is being done on that now. Next slide. We do have a number of insecticides that you can use even now for lanternfly. Some of these are available under a so-called special local need or 24C label. These are Transtect and Xylam that contain the active ingredient dinotefuran. These are for Ailanthus or tree of heaven only, and I'll talk in a moment how that's used. There are other materials listed here. Some are, most actually are for landscapes. There's a trunk ejection, there's some foliar sprays. Some of these are available to us under these 2 EE labels, meaning that they're not actually labeled for use on plant hoppers, but we have special labels to allow their use. This is the preliminary list. We can add 2 more as of Friday to this list, Onyx Pro, which does include use on Christmas trees, as well as Talstar S Select. Those now have 2 EE labels for use in New York. We will be adding to this list in the coming weeks as we are able to work on them, but we should have more labels in place for those of us who need to use them in landscapes, nurseries, Christmas trees, and so forth. But this is the preliminary. Anyway, next slide, please. The materials that I just mentioned, Xylam and Transtect, they contain dinotefuran. In Pennsylvania, they're being used on Ailanthus to control spider lanternfly by treating these trap trees. They'll remove about 90% of the Ailanthus surrounding, and because Ailanthus is so highly attractive, the remaining adults will be seeking it in the late summer, early fall, and as they feed on these treated trees will then die. So the idea is to try to concentrate the population in the area on what's in an irresistibly attractive tree and control many of them that way. And from what I understand, that's working fairly well. It's not stopping it, but it is helping to suppress the population substantially. Next slide. There are some data showing efficacy against spider lanternfly, and these are data generated by Dave Bittinger and Heather Leach at Penn State University. You can find this even posted online. So what I've got listed here are a number of active ingredients of insecticides for which there are counterparts for use either on Christmas tree or ornamental plants in general. And we have bifenthrin, so that would be the active ingredient in Onyx Pro and Telstar S. Carbaryl, of course, is in 7. Phosmid is in Imidan, and so on and so forth. So you can see the list of materials there that have given pretty high levels, 100% or even slightly less mortality of the nymph stage when they were applied to peach. The work has not been done on ornamentals, but taking the results from peach, I think we can extrapolate what would be likely to happen on ornamental plants too. So you can see a few things were not very effective: spinosad, which is conserve or entrust, spirotetramat, which is contos, those were not, or movento, those were not highly effective like the others. Next slide, please. What is interesting is also to look at not just what things control them, but what can keep controlling them after the application was made. So this slide just shows residual activity 7 and 14 days later. And you can see that some materials are still pretty effective even a week later, say bifenthrin, carbaryl, and phosmet. Others have their residual activity is much reduced, so not very much really makes it past the 14-day period, but you're still getting pretty good efficacy. So this might matter if you have adults that are reinvading into an area and you'd like residual control, but if you're just dealing with nymphs, you don't really need to have something with a long residual activity. Next slide. So if you suspect spotted lanternfly, certainly contact one of us or one of the extension specialists in your area. Please get samples, get photographs, and there's a email address you can send those images to, and we'd like to know more about that if you suspect it. So keep your eyes peeled, and hopefully we won't be seeing it. Any questions? There's another website you can go to also to access more.
I was going to say, and I'll just, this is a new website that's just being created right now with the folks in Pennsylvania. And we put together a list of where to report and quarantine guidelines for the states in the whole Northeast. And so if you check back there, probably by the time the recording is done, there'll be resources there if you're outside of New York State about where you should report it and the regulations. So great. And that brings us to questions. And Nancy, do we have any questions?
I answered the questions, but I just have one comment to make, and that is on one of the spotted lanternfly Facebook pages I saw where somebody was scraping egg masses into a bag, and I guess either they didn't have enough alcohol or they didn't have any alcohol, and they actually got the eggs to hatch. And they did just kind of a citizen scientist experiment where they kept them alive, did not feed them, and they lived in the bag for like 12 to 14 days before they finally expired. So they they are pretty resilient apparently with without the covering on them.
Pretty amazing. And I don't know, just to comment from my side too, I don't know right now anything that actually controls eggs as a spray on the egg masses. I'm not sure if Tim or anybody else has heard of that, but that would be something to find out or to evaluate.
All right, well, in that case, we shall move on to Ethan Angell, who is going to give us a regulatory update. And Ethan, would you like to take it away?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. Just real quick, coordination of spotted lanternfly here in New York State is a cooperative effort between New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, as well as New York State DEC and several of our partners. They include New York State DOT, New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation. Of course, New York State IPM program and the wonderful folks at the Cornell Cooperative Extension, and our partners over at the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, the PRISMs, where folks can get involved in invasive species. Next slide. Oh, and USDA, I apologize, I forgot about our federal counterparts, can't forget them. So quarantines, one of the things I really want to stress for folks, people get a little alarmed when we start talking about quarantines and what quarantines are. Quarantines, when we talk about plant pests, is not a complete shutdown of products moving out of that area that's designated as being quarantined. There are allowed movements out of the quarantine. What we do is we identify what are considered regulated articles. And articles or regulated articles are those items that could vector or move a plant pest beyond the boundary of the quarantine. And so by identifying those, we then identify ways in which those articles could be treated so that they're not infested with spotted lanternfly. And as you heard earlier in the presentations by many of the presenters, this is a very difficult task because spotted lanternfly can be found on just about anything. Next slide. You've also seen this slide before. It was mentioned several times. I think Brian brought it up. and this was showing, you know, how spotted lanternfly had moved out of the quarantine area. But what I want to focus on with this particular map is the areas that are under quarantine. So the areas that you see in blue are under a state quarantine by New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. We consider this an exterior quarantine, a quarantine placed on another state. And you can also see those red lines. And what those red lines indicate is those states have implemented a quarantine on themselves. So that's an interior quarantine. So the state of Pennsylvania and the state of New Jersey have implemented quarantines. And actually, this is a little out of date because Delaware just enacted their quarantine. That was announced the end of last week. So we can now add Delaware as having their own quarantine in place. But Virginia has not, and actually there is an infestation in Maryland, and they have not included a quarantine. So as an effort to protect New York and protect our growers and our economy, we've placed an exterior quarantine on states that have spotted lanternfly. Next slide. And again, with the quarantine area, I think some of the things that are confusing to most folks is that they hear Pennsylvania's under quarantine or New Jersey's under quarantine. Well, it's not the entire state. It's just the counties. And so you saw the counties in the map there, and you can see them listed here. This is the regulation. This is part 142. And you can see the actual counties that are under quarantine. And the biggest one is obviously Pennsylvania with 13 counties listed there. Next slide. And so I mentioned earlier, we identify what we consider regulated articles, and this is directly out of Part 142, out of the regulation here. And I've highlighted a couple things that are important to note. The first one, obviously, is spotted lanternfly itself. Spotted lanternfly in all of its life stages is a regulated article. So if you saw those pictures that Dan had put up before, if those items weren't listed as regulated articles, the spotted lanternfly on them would be regulated and therefore subject to the provisions within this regulation. The other one that's most common that we see a lot is landscaping, remodeling, and construction waste, specifically on the landscape debris. A lot of nursery stock, other items coming in to support the landscape industry. Those are things that we're concerned about. The other one is packing material. So Dan showed that great picture of pears being packed up. Packing material is one of those areas that we see spotted lanternfly getting into, and most notably things that are being shrink wrapped and pallets that are being stored outside. So pallets being stored outside, they can lay their eggs on, and then items that are being shrink wrapped into the later months in the fall when it becomes colder, spotted lanternfly will migrate and get underneath that shrink wrap to heat up, or get onto stone and other things that are heat sources to warm up, because as it gets colder, they get a little lethargic before they die off. And of course, all plants and plant parts, we've seen it moving on nursery stock, so that's something to be of concern, especially for you folks on the phone that are Christmas tree growers. You definitely want to be looking at your material that you're going to line out your Christmas tree blocks. And then outdoor household articles, which is a big concern. So things like grills, shovels, boats, campers, things that are stored outside that spotted lanternfly can crawl around and lay their eggs on is a particular concern. And then of course we have a catch-all on the bottom there, which is basically anything that we believe that might be infested becomes a regulated article by the inspector. Next slide. So we mentioned that a quarantine isn't a complete prohibition of material moving out of the quarantine area. There is ways that it can move out, and certificates of inspection are the way in which we do that. Don't get hung up on the language. In other states, they refer to it as a permit. That permit that's being issued does meet our definition of a certificate of inspection. It also has to be accompanied by a waybill. And this is very important for our inspectors that are out on the roads checking material coming through. This allows us to know where it came from and where it's destined to, and whether it should be regulated and subject to this part. Also, anything that's moving through the quarantine area from an area that's not known to be quarantined and destined to New York or through New York also has to have a waybill and has to move directly through the quarantine area without stopping, with the exception of fueling and traffic conditions. Next slide, please. So how to obtain a permit or certificate of inspection? These are issued by the state in which you're moving the product out of or you're going into. So this is the link down in Pennsylvania. Most people are using the Pennsylvania permitting system. There is reciprocity amongst the states, so we will accept permits that are issued by Pennsylvania if you're coming out of New Jersey and the like. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to Pennsylvania's website there. You're going to click on the left side of the page where it says spotted lanternfly, click on the quarantine box, and then you'll be able to review the permit training and go on and take that test. There is actually a online permit training that you have to go through, and then a test at the end, and then indicate what you need for permits. Next slide. So we are conducting shipment inspections, as I mentioned earlier. We are looking at shipments that arrive at the destination as well as in transit. The thing that is important for all of you is that as you receive your Christmas tree seedlings and your liners, every plant material that's moved in the state of New York has to have a certificate of inspection, regardless of where it came from. That's required under Article 14, and that's to protect you as a grower, to make sure that you're not getting any kind of plant pests. So if you're seeing material coming in and it doesn't have a certificate of inspection, let us know. If you're getting material from the quarantine area that we've indicated earlier, make sure that it has a permit specifically for spotted lanternfly in addition to the certificate of inspection for general plant material. And this is important to make sure that the place that you're buying from is in compliance with our rules and regulations as well as their state rules and regulations. And if you see any issues, please report them to us so that we can try to get those growers in compliance and notify those states. Next slide. And so the biggest thing here is the take-home message. Obviously, learn to identify spotted lanternfly as you're inspecting the material that's coming in. You want to know what spotted lanternfly looks like so you can identify it and let us know. You definitely want to inspect all the items coming out of the quarantine zone. I know Dan mentioned this and made this very clear. I want to reiterate this point. That's very important. And if you're visiting the quarantine area, so in other words, if you're going down to pick up material, your vehicle is now subject to that, plus whatever you picked up. So make sure that you are adhering to the regulations of where you're going into. And then if you see it, report it. We have a great email system that's set up. Right there, you can see it's spottedlanternfly@dec.ny.gov. You'll get an automated response. There is a fillable form in there to allow you to fill in some information, and somebody will be getting back to you. And again, retain the specimen. That's very important because we're going to have somebody come out and follow up with you. We're going to want to get that specimen and send it off for identification. And of course, there's always great resources at the New York State IPM Spotted Lanternfly webpage. Thank you.
All right, great. And are there any questions? It looks like we have one, Nancy.
Yep. Are Christmas trees in New York already regulated to assure that trees are pest-free? And second is, if there is a requirement for treatment, what would that be effective on spotted lanternfly?
So the quarantine that New York has placed is not on New York itself. It's on the other states that have infestations. So if you're growing Christmas trees in New York, you're not regulated under spotted lanternfly regulations. So in that case, there is no treatments that would be authorized or needed. Obviously, if you believe you have spotted lanternfly in your Christmas trees, we'd want you to notify us so that we can look at it and determine if it is an infestation. But again, the important point here is it's an exterior quarantine. It's placed on other states. There is no quarantine on New York itself.
What about for other pests, though? I think that's what he's asking.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we have quarantines on a lot of other pests, and pests above what we would consider an economic threshold are regulated by New York State agricultural markets, and that's at the discretion of the inspector at the time of inspection. In terms of Christmas trees, we traditionally do not inspect Christmas trees as part of our registration of growers and dealers. We will go out and inspect Christmas trees if they need it for a shipment to get out of the state. Some states require a shipment inspection, so we will do that. Or if a Christmas tree grower has a significant problem that they want us to come in and look at. Some Christmas tree growers do register with us because they'd like us to come in and do an inspection for them. But, you know, unless there's a major problem within the Christmas industry, we traditionally don't inspect Christmas trees.
Great, thank you. So remember the poll that we had at the beginning? We have the same poll coming up. We'd love you to just take a couple of minutes to go through and answer those questions again. There's also a question in there where you can ask for a certificate of completion. We've had several people who have asked us for certificates of completion. If you check yes to that question, I will email you a link to a certificate of completion that you can download. So I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes to answer those questions, and then I'll ask one of our presenters to go through the answers so that you're clear on which ones were the right ones. Okay, I see 48% of you have had time to submit. I'm just going to give it 30 more seconds for you to complete, and then I'll show you the answers and ask one of our presenters to talk us through it. Great, that's 61% of you, which is about the same percentage that in the beginning. I will end the poll and share the results. And whoever wants to dive in and talk us through the answers, that would be great.
Okay, this is Tim. Looks like we have a extremely knowledgeable crowd. Splotch of mud for the egg mass starts out white but ends up resembling a splotch of mud is correct. Prime characteristics, traits you would be looking for to identify the first 3 instars, black with white. Yep, very good. What makes the 4th instar easily identifiable from the first 3? It does turn red and continues with the white spot. And what is the prime characteristic trait you would be looking for to identify the adult spotted lanternfly? And it is approximately 1 inch long with the outer wings having black spots. And I am going to turn the remainder of the questions over to Ethan.
Great, thanks, Tim. So question number 7, do growers need a permit or certificate of inspection to ship plants from the quarantine area? Everybody got that one right, great job. Is the general public regulated by the spotted lanternfly quarantine? And so the answer is yes. So to try and minimize the impact of spotted lanternfly, everybody in those quarantine areas is regulated to make sure that we don't have spotted lanternfly moving inadvertently into states that aren't quarantined. And then lastly, who regulates spotted lanternfly in New York State? The regulation is Part 142, and it is housed within New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. In this case, New York State DEC does have some regulations over invasive species, but they don't have anything on spotted lanternfly. And the United States Department of Agriculture, who traditionally does do some quarantine work, does not have a quarantine in place.
Great, thank you. All right, so
I did get one late question.
okay.
Any info on how the infestation in Korea has progressed since introduction in 2006?
Yes.
That's a great question.
It took over this is South Korea that we have the information on, and it actually took over South Korea in a year. And I've had some people say, well, quarantines don't work. Look, you put the quarantine in place and spotted lanternfly is still getting out. But if you think about it, you're never going to get 100%, but considering how contained Pennsylvania has been able to keep spotted lanternfly with that initial quarantine, compared to South Korea where no such steps were taken, I think is admirable. Speaking with Heather Leach from Penn State Extension, she's the spotted lanternfly coordinator down there. And it sounds like that was one of the questions at a conference was, so what's happening in South Korea now? And it appears that some of the biological control that we're looking at bringing in has been adopted in South Korea, and it seems to be doing a relatively good job with spotted lanternfly over there. And it's only a problem in years that really favor development of the pest. So there is hope.
And just one last thing to add to Tim's comment, this is Ethan. South Korea and Pennsylvania roughly are about the same size geographically. So if you're taking that into account, it's not like South Korea is bigger or smaller, and so it was able to spread easier. They're about the same size. So the quarantine has, if you look at how much it's spread in Pennsylvania, it's been minimal compared to what we saw in South Korea, and in about the same amount of time too.
Right. Good point.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so there's a couple of last things I'd love to point out to you. One is we have a new website on our website, new webpage called Find a Colleague. And our goal is to increase interactions in the Northeast between researchers and growers. And so we have this Find a Colleague site where you can post information about yourself and your interests and your work. And hopefully it'll be a conduit for people putting together collaborative projects across states. And this webinar is a great example that insects don't care about state lines. The archive of today's webinar will be up probably early next week. I'll send you an email with a link to that as soon as it's available. And we have another webinar this afternoon for nursery, greenhouse, and landscape industries. And you're welcome to join that. We'll cover this pretty much the same materials. There may be a couple of different slides focused on those particular interests. But you're welcome to join us, or feel free to pass the information along to somebody who would enjoy it.
Brianna, I have a question. There's a question there from, oh, I can see we're getting an answer about a printable version of the webinar available. Because it's in the chat rather than the questions, maybe everyone won't see the answer or the question. But Nancy says, yes, we're working on getting the PDF of the presentation up on the Northeast IPM Center Spotted Lanternfly page, and we'll let you know once it's there.
Okay, great, wonderful.
Question, thanks, Marnie.
Great, and I do want to acknowledge the sources of funding that make this all possible. The Northeastern IPM Center, we're funded by NIFA, which is an agency within USDA, and of course Cornell Cooperative Extension, New York's Department of Agriculture and Markets, and the New York State Integrated Pest Management Center. So all of us, we work for different parts of these agencies that are listed here or are funded by them. And so I want to appreciate the effort that's gone into putting this together. This has definitely been a collaborative effort. And you know, since this is a relatively new thing, it's taken a lot of work to do. So thank you to all of the presenters for everything that it took for you to be here today, your careers, your education, your dedication and persistence over the years to give you the expertise so that you could dive in and be able to speak with us so knowledgeably today. So with that, I will just say thank you very much, and look forward to sending you an email with a link to a recording next week. And thank you to the presenters.